Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome, everybody. This is episode number 3, and I must say I have a special episode in store for you. Last week, you heard me talking about my personal journey and why I'm so connected to helping victims of narcissistic people and then also working with narcissistic people as well. And this week, I wanted to follow up and talk about, an area in which I had mentioned before in my first podcast where I talked about, my parents having a rocky relationship and then finally going through a divorce. And so I have a special guest on, Miss Nicol Stolar-Peterson, who is a licensed clinical social worker. I brought her on because she has expertise in child custody evaluations. She's been working with children and families for over 15 years. She's worked in private therapeutic settings as well as in the public sector, such as Child Protective Services. She has a wide range of expertise, including in the areas of mediation, child forensic interviewing, adoptions, child custody evaluations, and co-parenting boot camp, and CPS law enforcement investigations. She has completed hundreds of child abuse investigations, and I thought, what better way to follow up my last podcast than to have a chat with Nicole, who talks about her experience in working with people who are fighting their narcissistic partners in court for child custody evaluations and in family court. She talks about her work as both a coach and a forensic evaluator. So she's going to share with us some tips on how to go through a child custody battle with someone who does not necessarily have the best interests of you or your children at heart. So stay tuned and check out my interview with Nicole. I think it's a real treat. Hi, Nicole. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. And I want to say thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. I appreciate you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Sure. So, Nicole, can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do in your practice? You have a pretty unique specialty.
I do. My very long name is Nicol Stolar-Peterson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a board certified diplomat of clinical social work. It's a mouthful. Basically, my area of expertise is in the area of court. And so I specialize in child custody evaluations. I specialize in helping folks prepare for court, whether it's a therapist or a client. I also do lawsuits where I'm brought in as the consultant or the expert witness. So I will do overall a consultation or case audit to look for any culpability on the part of either side. So I do a little bit of everything. And then in all my spare time, I run a nonprofit. And that in nonprofit, we help children who have to prepare to make an appearance in court or testify in court, whether they're in foster care or they have been a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime. So we do a lot of trauma reduction because court is a pretty scary place for kiddos, especially for adults, right? So even if you're just serving jury duty, people get nervous and you haven't done anything wrong. So just that environment can be scary. So that's really my area of specialty is helping a lot of folks get past that fear, and then also doing assessments on behalf of the court to be able to provide to the court so they can make a better decision regarding children and custody.
Wow. It sounds like that can be a pretty tough role to be in sometimes.
It can be. It's a shift from being a therapist versus being an evaluator. And,
Mhm.
sometimes it's really hard when you know that kid just really needs a hug and needs the parents to stop fighting. And you're there as the evaluator, not as the therapist, because it's definitely a big shift for me. I have to really remember that hat's on my head when I go in that room.
Right. Okay. And so can you talk a little bit about how you got into the role that you're doing now? How did your career transform into what you are now?
Sure. I was actually a social worker for Child Protective Services for almost 12 years. I did child abuse investigations and forensic interviewing, as well as adoptions. And during that time, you spend a lot of time in and out of court. My first court appearance was a, a bomb of all bombs. It was horrible. I wasn't prepared. I was told just read your notes and tell the truth and it'll
Oh
be fine. And it
no.
was horrible. It was horrible. I was like, this is the worst thing ever. Who gives that kind of advice? So after that experience, I went back to court and I was like, remember me? Could you please, share with me and help me today and just learn? And so I sat in court for an entire day. The attorneys were extremely giving and explained things to me as the day went on. And as the more I understood the environment and the different rules that occur in court, it really brought down a lot of the anxiety around the courtroom setting. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. There's so much you don't see when you walk in the courtroom, but if you hang out long enough, you can kind of pick up on all those little nuances. And it really does help you by the time you're sitting on that stand or that you have to show up to that courtroom. So that became a little bit of a niche for me. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So as my career kept going, I kept really focusing more on court, focusing on how things get done in the courtroom, less about how things should be versus how things are. And that is a big shift, I think, for a lot of people, how things should be versus how they are. And
Mm.
that was a big shift for me. And so court, for me, it's not that it's easy, but I get it now. And so I like sharing that knowledge with others of, okay, this is what I understand about the playing rules, and it changes the outcomes truly of a day in court. So I love court, and that's how I landed there.
Okay. And so in your work, can you talk more specifically about what your passion is and what you're passionate about in your work?
Sure. I'm very passionate about helping kids. And that usually means that you need to help the parents
Okay.
because you can only do so much with a kid. I just describe this as it's like sticking a Band-Aid on, and then the second they walk out of your office, one of the parents maybe rips off the Band-Aid intentionally or not intentionally. And so the work has been shifting towards helping parents, especially going through custody and divorce,
Mm.
um, especially when certain personalities and behaviors start to stir up, if you will,
Yes.
because they're under stress. And so the kids become this piece of almost a tool, if you will. And that's not what kids are supposed to be. They're just supposed to
Yes.
be kids. And so I think as time has gone on, I've really had to shift my focus to making sure that I can do whatever work I can with the parents or with the court to try to help protect the kids. And that's really tricky at times.
Sounds like it. It
Mhm.
sounds like it. And so what would you say that the toughest part of your job is?
The toughest part is probably just getting people to move, just to move a little bit. People get really stuck in their behaviors and their thoughts.
Yes.
And unfortunately, what happens with that is even though their heart, they love their kids, or they might even love themselves or someone else, because they're so stuck in that behavior pattern, they tend to not move from it. They dig their heels in and things get worse and they have no idea why. So learning to help people look ahead and behind them as well in regards to what outcomes could occur depending on their behaviors and
Mhm.
how that can shift. And so it's been an ongoing process, learning for me too, just because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But again, that's part of getting to know our clients and how we can help them
Sure.
overcome some of those obstacles that they may have created themselves or somebody else placed in front of them.
Sure. And I could see how that would be very difficult, especially when you have two people that are fighting,
Mm-hmm.
or they're trying to gain power in a relationship, or they're trying to get power or control over children. And I can see dynamics shifting way left,
Mm-hmm.
if you will. And so how do you balance that? How do you manage that? How do you try to get people to move, so to speak?
So, so I actually have a something I developed a few years back, off of a positive parenting class that I had taken, and it really showed, listing off characteristic traits that you want your kids to have as adults. And it's really a fun list to make. And it's when you see the shoulders come down and they start to enjoy making this list and talking about their
Yes.
children in this hopeful way. And so when we do that, then we also make a list of, okay, where are the kids now? And then what are some of the things that are happening around them? And then there's this middle space that's empty and that we have to fill.
Mm,
And I said, what do you think, what do we have to fill this with in order to get to this beautiful list that you have? Do you think that filling it with these things is going to get your kid to this characteristic trait? Or if this behavior happens, it's probably going to be a different trait. So then we start talking about what those other traits might be, the
right.
outcomes of their behavior.
Right.
It's very concrete. It's very visual. We make a big, it's almost like a poster. And when they look at it, there's typically some tears. There's typically a sense of, oh my gosh, wait a minute. That's not how I want this to.
Right.
And so there usually can be some shift off of that. And then I take that opportunity to go back into some of our goals for co-parenting or
Mm,
just for themselves as individuals. And because by then, typically they've calmed down a bit in the
yeah.
room. They're able to really take in some of that information, and then they're able to come up with some great ideas, which is typically not what we get. So when then I bring that poster out again and again as we do our work of, okay, this is where we want to be headed, but here we are now. And then again we fill it in. And so again, just having it be visual for them is extremely helpful.
Okay. And you spoke about getting people to move. What about the ones that don't? How do you
So
manage that?
the ones that don't, there are some that don't. And depending on what I'm seeing them for, if I'm seeing them as a therapist versus an evaluator, as an evaluator, if they're not moving, they're not sharing the kids, if they're alienating, if they're harming them in some way,
Yes.
typically not going to end up with the kids in their care or less time with the kids in their care. And that's a horrible outcome. And
Yes.
it would be, it would be a perfect world if everyone could share. And honestly, the ability to share, just like sharing your favorite toy, you love it. When you're little, you don't want others to play with it. You don't want it to get broken. You have all these fears for this toy. And then the first time that you let somebody play with it and then it comes back to you in its whole piece and you're like, oh, thank goodness, my toy's okay. And then you start to learn a little trust and maybe you can lend that toy again. But if you lend that toy and it gets broken, you've learned that people break your stuff and maybe they don't care about it the same way you do. And when that happens in relationships and with kids, the sharing really starts to reduce. And those who cannot share, especially when it comes to relationships and children, it ends up not going well in court, because they tend to be making decisions based on the I, me, my versus
Yes.
what's best for my kid.
Wow. Wow. And I can see that that can put you in a role where you can be liked versus disliked very easily, to put
Well,
it mildly.
let me say this. If I'm doing a child custody evaluation, guaranteed that there's, there's two parents. One parent will not be happy at the end of every child custody evaluation.
Yes.
So my percentage rates for satisfaction, pretty, but I expect that. And so I don't, expect everyone to be hugging, even those who maybe get what maybe more of a percentage or maybe even get the kids full time. there still may be other things in the recommendations that they may not be happy with in regards to their parents. So either way, I pretty much expect people to not be really that happy with me after an evaluation. But
I
after
see.
lawsuits, they love me. Like, those are, I have a lot better. The attorneys love me because I have an investigative brain, so I usually come up with some solutions in a different way. But yeah, evaluations not so much.
I see. Okay. That sounds very interesting, but it also sounds like it could be compromising. How do you find balance after working with people and making decisions for children like this?
I'm grateful for my community. I've been really blessed with a close-knit group of therapists that I can call and say, "Oh my gosh, today, today, I've learned to do deep breathing after something difficult leaves my office. I've learned
Mm.
to really sit back and look at it because by the time I get home, I want to be in a good place. I want to be
Yeah,
calm. I want to be able to function as a parent, as a wife, as a friend, as a
sure.
human being. And so I'm pretty aware when I don't have a big enough space of time to really come down and process whatever the day has been, especially if it's been one of the more difficult days.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. And how do people usually refer to you? How do you normally get your referrals?
So depending on what it is, so if it's for child custody evaluation, um, typically the referrals are going to come from an attorney because all the evaluators are on a court-appointed list, and so then they select three from that list, and then they go to court and determine which one out of the three they're gonna pick. But in regards to helping somebody do, prepare for court to walk in and be able to stand tall and not cry in a courtroom and meet their goals of asking for child support or whatever it is. Those typically come from other therapists
Okay.
or somebody who's just heard that's kind of the work that I specialize in and hoping I can help. And then for therapy, again, I'm working with kids who typically are in the middle of a horrible custody battle and
Sure.
or have a history of sexual abuse. That's another area that I specialize in. Those
Wow.
typically come from attorneys, minors counsel who are aware of my work and my background at CPS. So they'll call. But as far as lawsuits go, that's typically a few attorneys that have heard my name or seen my work on a various lawsuit and have wanted to work just because, again, my background with CPS typically is, I would call it like my selling point, probably because there's not a lot of former CPS workers who really specialize in this and are willing to go up on the stand and do expert witness testimony.
I see. You also provide coaching to women. Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct?
True.
Can
Mm-hmm.
you tell us a little bit about the coaching aspect of what you do?
Sure. So this actually started with a colleague of mine saying, "I've got this client. Every time they leave court, they don't know what happened. Nothing's going in their favor. Could you maybe help them? Could you work with them?" And I said, "Well, it would definitely be coaching. It's going to be pretty directive." And she said, "That's fine." So I worked with her client. And what I found is that the more we talked, I realized the client was going in feeling very overwhelmed. She didn't have a list of goals that she wanted to have met in the courtroom. She just knew she had to be there. She would speak very emotionally, which typically doesn't go over very well with judges because they have a very short period of time to take in a lot of information. They need it short, concise, objective. And when someone is sitting at that table crying and falling into pieces, the person at the other table who maybe is standing taller, who could be more manipulative, could be narcissistic, they could be just somebody who does better under pressure
Yes.
overall. They
Yes.
typically are going to often have a better day in court because they're going to go in with the list of things that they want. They're not ready to take no for an answer, so they're going to stay very focused on that. And they might even enjoy seeing that the other person is falling apart. And so
Mm,
understanding that happens all of the time in a
mm,
courtroom is helping the person who typically would go in and fall apart and say, "Hey, listen, let's fall apart now, right? Let's get it over with now. And then let's prepare you. Let's get you ready. Let's get you stronger so that when you walk in that courtroom, you have your list of goals. You're clear on, okay, so today I'm going to be here for child support, or today I'm coming in for a restraining order, or today it's, just to get phone calls or whatever that is. Clear, concise, and then a little note to themselves, remember who you are. Because typically there's a mama bear somewhere in there. And that mama bear needs to go in there, stand tall. And when they do, it's amazing. The phone calls after court, oh my gosh, Nicole, I got this, or this worked out. And, I didn't get all of this, but I did get this. And I can't believe it. And I'm just, and I'm shaking, and court's never gone like that for me. But again, realizing the rules of that courtroom, it's not a therapy office. They don't have time to see people fall apart. They just want to know, what do we need to get done? Does it meet the requirements of the law? Can we do this? Can we do that? And then can we finish so that I can get on to the next case? Because family law court is the most impacted courtroom in the state of California, at least.
Wow.
There's just they're so busy. So they just don't have time for that. And that can be frustrating if you're a bench officer trying to keep your calendar moving. So knowing all of those things about that environment, it makes it a lot easier for me to help somebody succeed and overcome some of those fears and really get their goals met, because we're able to really focus on what's going to happen in that room, and then the rules, of course, of that room.
It sounds like, for lack of a better word, it sounds like it can be a war zone in there.
It can feel like a war zone, very much so. And the calmest person in the room is typically the bench officer, because they're so used to seeing, every 15 minutes there's a new case coming in, and it's public. FYI, anybody can sit in unless, the judge has sealed the room, which typically they only do if there's a child testifying. But for the most part, other people can sit in on the trial, on any hearings, listening to very specific details regarding the restraining order. It's really kind of surreal. I mean, I still find it surreal, and I sit in there all the time and I'm thinking, this doesn't feel comfortable. I feel like I'm in their living room right now, listening to the worst of the worst that's happened. It's really a strange environment, I have to say.
Wow. You mentioned, and as you know, the podcast is about narcissistic folks, and you mentioned having to interact with narcissistic parents.
Sure.
You said that they come across as very confident in the courtroom. They go in, they know what they want. Can you tell me about, what does a narcissistic parent look like for other people who just don't know, and they just think, oh, well, I know something's wrong here with my partner.
Right.
I'm not sure what it is. How does that look? What does that look like in a courtroom? And how should your client, or just anyone who's struggling with somebody like that, be prepared to deal with that?
So to me, I used to joke about this, but I mean, I guess it makes sense. It would be a lot easier sometimes if narcissists wore a t-shirt that said I, me, and my. Because what you find is that most sentences tend to start off with I, me, my, and or you are the reason, you, and that's really something to be aware of, because if you're starting to second guess yourself, you're starting to think, maybe I am a bad parent, maybe there's probably something going on there. Somebody's probably trying to light something up in you. And put you on the defense, make you feel like you're going a little crazy. Oftentimes in a courtroom, what it does look like is the parent who is not narcissistic, who is trying to be hopefully protective and not alienating, but they tend to look a little crazy. They tend to start feeling like they're going crazy. And they'll start to think, maybe I did do something wrong, or maybe I don't know what I'm doing, or maybe there's a reason, this happened. And so when those feelings start coming up, that's usually like a big alert to say, wait a minute. This might be what somebody's putting on you, but you have to be able to have your deflector coat so that you don't absorb it all. And that's when you start feeling like that, it's a good alert to be aware of who's around you. And if you're starting to feel that way, think, okay, wait a minute. I didn't feel that way before you came home, or I didn't feel that way before I interacted with you. And then to really look at that person and then take them in for, they're telling me their story.
Yeah.
They're really telling me their story, but that takes a lot of insight and processing, which is pretty hard when somebody's coming at you with something pretty emotional. Because again, we might start feeling hurt and start second guessing ourselves. And so when all those feelings start coming up, I'm like, there should be flags waving. It would be great if they were visual so you could see them and say, oh, wait, this is what could be happening right now.
Yes.
And then in a courtroom, what can happen, and I've seen the shift too, which is kind of fun, but initially what you would see is somebody who you have identified possibly as a narcissist on one side, and you have the other parent. The narcissist typically will stand tall, will be very confident, might even lean back in their chair very comfortably in a courtroom, which is odd. If I see anything but a judge or an attorney or the cop in the room leaning back, I think that's interesting. They've got their hands behind their head. They're kind of trying to own their space. Wow, that's pretty amazing for this type of setting, because most people don't interact that way. So I noticed that body language is significant, but also how they're interacting and the condescending tone that often comes out. But what I've seen when I've seen the shift is this: when the narcissist doesn't get that outcome, doesn't get that reaction, doesn't get the crying from the other party, doesn't get where they fall apart, when they start to sit quietly and stay very focused and make objective statements about their concerns, that's typically when there's a shift in the other space for the narcissist. And you can see where they start to get upset and they start to come undone. Typically because the other party's not engaging, they're not giving them what they typically would want, they're showing up a little bit stronger. So then they might start coming undone a little bit, and or if the bench officer asks them a question, questioning them in a certain way, they might start getting defensive. And then you see something shift in that room where the bench officer becomes aware of, wait a second, maybe you're the issue after all. So it's really an interesting shift. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But when you show up to that room and you don't behave in a way that typically maybe the narcissist is used to, that is unsettling, and you can see a shift.
Yes. It sounds like it. And that falls in line with what I know about narcissistic people. When you find that the other person is getting the upper hand or they feel like they're losing control, you see them spin into almost like a rage.
Which is beneficial in a courtroom if up
Yes.
until then they've been kind of running the show. And so again, that's kind of how there can be a win now for someone who typically they might be a victim of abuse or something. And if they can hold on and stand strong in that room, give it enough time, typically that other person will probably unravel. And you want the bench officer to see that, because up until then they haven't. And so it's really like a quick snapshot into their lives.
Yeah.
And you're hoping that the bench officer can see that.
Makes sense. For people that are going through this stress in court and trying to keep it together, because I imagine that not just for you, but for the person that's on the other end of the narcissistic partner, this is extremely stressful. What advice would you have for them to take care of themselves and to hold it together outside of court, and just so that they can continue to go through this grueling, emotionally taxing, financially it's a very expensive process where I'm sure they feel like they're going crazy or they're extremely stressed out all the time? What can they do to take care of themselves and keep it together, as well as their kids?
I think one of the most important things they have to do is they've got to go to therapy. They need a sounding board, because the great thing about therapists is that we don't have a pre-existing relationship with our clients, and so we don't have the same agendas that our family members and our friends do, who are just going to say things that they think we need to hear or want to hear. And that's something that isn't necessarily as helpful when you're going through something this severe. You need your friends and family to support you, but you really need a very neutral sounding board to be able to go in and really share these concerns, because there is such a point where you feel like you are going crazy, especially when going through divorce and custody. So to have that sounding board, to me, is like the ultimate important piece for anyone. Have that in place, have that sounding board. And if they have the capacity to have somebody give them some directive coaching so that they can do better in court, so that they can show up to mediation stronger, so that they can stay focused on the goals instead of leaving with the, I wish I said this, I wish I said that, I could have, woulda, shoulda, coulda.
Yeah.
So the more effective we are, the better we feel. So when we have something scary like that and we do good at it, we leave feeling stronger. Well, that carries over to everything else. So again, not going into court and feeling beat up, but going into court and thinking, okay, I'm going to focus on these things. I'm not going to talk to them when I walk out of the courtroom. I'm going to make sure I park over here and not run into them in the parking lot. All those little things to control more of the environment, and then to prepare. What if they do come up to me? How will that be for me? And really prepare for that. And if you prepare for it, when they come up and say something horrible or something manipulative or whatever that is, that person's then able to go, oh, I already knew this was happening. And say, okay, well, you have a great day. Not engage and just walk away.
Yeah.
And that is that being prepared, but having a sounding board. It's everything, because people all the time will say, then I left court and then he came up to me in the parking lot, or he called me and he said this. But if you think, you already know that's going to happen, he's going to wait for you. This is going to happen here. The next visit's going to be this. Prepare. Don't just say, oh, I know it's going to be horrible. Okay, that. Let's move on from that. What are you going to do to prepare and be stronger? And the more your kids see you not engaging, being polite, being professional, because I like to speak of co-parenting as the new relationship. It's a new business relationship. Yeah. It's handshakes, it's being polite, even if the other person is not. Your kids deserve to see at least one of you, if not both, behaving in a professional, kind, polite manner, not being a doormat, not being a bulldozer, but in that capacity, because it's going to teach them too that through life, as we don't get along with people, we can still find a way to be polite. We can still interact in a positive way that's not going to hurt our kids or those around us. And so it's really an opportunity to show our kids what we're capable of. And then you can go cry in the bathroom. Absolutely. Take a glass of wine if you need it. Go to the bathroom. But when we come out of there, we're going to be stronger, because we have to be for our kids. And there's female narcissists and male narcissists. So whoever it is, whoever's coming out of that bathroom after a good cry, we have to show up for our kids no matter what.
Yeah. And I would have to agree with you. It does sound like a business, or maybe even like you're going to school and to give a presentation. Really, you have to show up and be polished, be well prepared, and just walk in there, do what you have to do, state the facts, be professional, leave the emotions out of it, no matter how ugly the other partner tries to get in the room, and just be able to walk out of it. And then you brought up another issue that I think a lot of people forget, or they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily at the forefront of their mind, which is that at the end of the day, they are still a role model for their children, and their children are watching them just to see what's going on and how to behave in a relationship, how to behave in a relationship with a man or a woman, or whoever your partner happens to be, or just in general. And knowing the things that people will do to try and get the upper hand. You have mentioned working with children as well. Can you talk a little bit more about your work with children that you do that are caught up in this fray?
Sure. I tend to get referrals for kids who there's a concern in the courtroom that they've been coached by one or both parents, or they're being alienated. And I really want to differentiate between gatekeeping and alienation. Okay. Gatekeeping can really come across more as a protective parent who's trying to make good choices. An example would be the child received an injury the day before that perhaps indicates abuse from the other parent, and the other parent saying, this isn't safe, I need to keep them home today, I need to take them to the doctor, I need to take these other steps. That is gatekeeping. Alienation is they might have first right of refusal, which means the other parent has to be given the opportunity to take the kids if the other parent's unavailable for 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, instead of hiring a babysitter. But instead of telling them that they are going to be gone for 24 hours to Palm Springs or wherever, instead of telling them that they will give them to a friend or to a grandparent and not give the other parent the first right of refusal, and then have the kids lie about where they were that day. Having kids lie about what did or didn't happen to them, especially in the area of sexual abuse, which is so significantly traumatizing. So children will be told, say that, mommy's boyfriend, touches you at night. And that is such a severely abusive falsehood to put in a child's mind, because kids really do question later, did that really happen to me? Did I really go through this? But again, even after as adults, the amount of trauma they experience, because they know that they influenced a custody case because they were brought in to testify, or they told the evaluator a lie, and maybe police came out, maybe they didn't, but then they spent the rest of the years living with the other parent. The amount of guilt, shame, and trauma that comes from coaching, that comes from having a child lie, is so significant. There's so much research that shows that these children as adults struggle with alcoholism and depression and suicide. And unfortunately, the parent who's telling them to lie is so focused on winning. They're so focused on the other parent is bad, so we need to amp it up a little bit, and we're going to say this is what's happening, or this probably could happen, so just go in and say that shift, when it's gotten to that point, is so detrimental to that child. So the work that I do is, when there's a concern that that's happening, they'll come to see me, and then I'll work with the child for a significant amount of time to determine whether or not they have in fact been coached. And typically most kids who've been coached have just been given a singular event. You were touched at night. Kids who've really had these experiences happen to them have horrible details leading up to, during, and after. And so they stand apart pretty significantly, in my office at least, when I'm talking with children and working with them. So I'm aware of how horrible and how detrimental it is on their little hearts, on their little heads, as they grow, falsehoods that have been placed into their minds. And then the outcome of living with one parent versus the other based upon that falsehood, that's a tremendous amount of responsibility to place on a child. And it's so harmful. And for some reason, though, it continues to be an issue. Not that there aren't true allegations of abuse, and there is true abuse, but this is something different, and it's so emotionally abusive that it's definitely, those are my harder days, I would say, is when those kids come in and feel like they have to lie to me and give me this story, because that's what's expected of them. That's hard to watch.
It sounds like it, and it sounds, I'm getting chills actually now, just thinking about it, and how scary that is, of just to even hear that, and just to know the long-term effects that coaching has. How do you, I guess my question is, how do you get them to take down the wall and find out that they're coaching? Because I imagine that they've been coached, rather. I imagine that they are making this decision and trying so hard to stick with what they're saying to you out of fear.
Right.
How do you break through that barrier and determine whether or not they've been coached?
Well, so one of the things that we do in my office is, there's a lot of pinky swearing that goes on regarding telling the truth and having a safe place. And I remind children, I work for you. I don't work for your mom. I don't work for your dad. I work for you. My job is to give you a safe place. And in this room, you can ask me whatever you want. I'm going to tell you the truth. And I expect the same from you. And so things tend to shift in the room after some time, after some rapport building, after some trust. And what we usually get to is they'll start to say something like, well, maybe I don't remember if that was something that happened to me, but I think it probably did. And I said, tell me about that. Tell me about it probably happening. Well, I think it probably did because so-and-so told me it did. Oh, okay. So that's different then, right? From something we remember instead of something somebody told us to remember. And they'll say, yeah, that is different. So we start really kind of talking about what that might be. And typically I'm working closely with the minors counsel at that point in regards to the safety of the child and whatever's happening with them. But typically at that point too, Child Protective Services has already been involved to some capacity, and whether or not a forensic interview has occurred. But really about working with that child is getting them to the point where, one, they're starting to trust themselves more, which is a hard shift too, because there's going to be more back and forth between them and the parent.
Yeah.
And that's going to be difficult. But if we get to the point where we realize that we've got enough information that one parent really is coaching them to lie, typically there's going to be admonishment from the court to that parent. Everybody's going to be in therapy by then.
Good.
And the kiddo, as we work together and keep going, they've learned that this is the room where we don't share things that other people want us to share. But I'll ask them, is there anything you're supposed to tell me today? Yeah, my dad wants me to tell you, da 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 da, or my mom wants to tell you. And I'll say, oh, okay, thank you for telling me what they wanted me to know. Okay, and then we just start at the very beginning. And when we really talk about their lives and their stories, those falsehoods aren't usually part of them.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good. And it sounds like you work, even in your work with children, you work on empowering them so that they can feel like they have a voice and making them feel safe, which unfortunately it sounds like it's not something that they can be at home.
Right, and they're encouraged to initiate their own safety plan. So if it's during school time, there's a school counselor, there's a teacher that they trust, there's a mandated reporting party that they can talk to. Because it's great if they talk to their friend's mom or somebody, but we don't really know that it's going to end up with a phone call to the right folks that need to be able to step in and hopefully help, and or encouraging them to be open with minors counsel. Because if they got to the point in family law court where they've been appointed minors counsel, it's pretty significant. It's a pretty litigious case. There's definitely a lot of contention. So minors counsel is really there just for that kiddo, just there for them to look after their best interests, because it's gotten to the point where the parents are so involved in the battle that the kids' best interests are not being looked after. So the guardian ad litem, aka minors counsel, is really the person that is interviewing the kids, talking with them. And it's when they talk about them, they refer to my client, right? You know, my client, whether they're 6, 12, 15, my client is asking for this and my client has these concerns. And it's really amazing when you have great minors counsel involved on behalf of the kids.
So what happens to them once you've determined whether or not they have been coached? What happens with them as far as you're concerned?
So they're going to see me for a little bit longer, but I'm typically going to be the shorter term therapist. I'm going to probably hand them off to a trauma play therapist that they can stick with for a very long time, unless it's a type of case where I still have a few that I hang on to, where they come see me once a month, because it's such a difficult and toxic case that I do worry that anybody new that gets their hands on it would have to start from scratch. And sometimes it's just checking in to make sure nothing new has happened, making sure that they're okay, that they're feeling safe, and then asking the court to give me the discretion to either increase or decrease their sessions. But it's just more of a check-in just to stay with them, because typically once coaching stops, once all of that craziness stops, they're fine. They're you know, if you just let them be kids, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So they come in and they, you know, we call it the catch up, and we catch up and see what's going on, and then we get into it a little bit, see if there's anything. But all of my kids can also email me, because I love emails, and most kids now email, which is frightening. So even 6-year-olds know how to email. Or they'll leave me a message. So just to let me know how things are going.
Good. That sounds great. And it sounds like you do a great job, a very stressful job But we definitely need more people like you, because it's, I've been doing the work that I do for quite some time, and I'd have to say you're the only person I know that does this kind of work.
Mhm.
And so I know that we need more people out there fighting the good fight for the children,
Mhm.
especially when their parents are going through a divorce. That's a stressful situation for any child, let alone a child that's being abused.
Right.
But part of me also wonders too that because you're in such a predicament, that there are going to be unhappy parents, and there's going to be not only that but unhappy cases.
Sure.
Does your work ever stick with you?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to say it doesn't. Oh my gosh, that'd be amazing. Oh, it doesn't bother me at all. I don't take it home ever. It's so easy to just walk out of my
Yeah.
office. Just kidding. No, there have been probably last year I had probably one of my toughest cases, and I thought, oh my gosh, this might be time for me to back away from these types of cases because this one's really hard.
Yeah.
And so as soon as I recognized that that's what was happening with me, I got on the phone with a colleague and I said, I need to talk right now
Yeah.
because my heart is broken. The bench officer did not do what I had hoped for, and I really was concerned for the safety of one of my kiddos, and it was just a really hard case.
Yeah.
And so, when the attorney calls you crying, and you want to cry, and you think, okay, this is a tough one, and it sat with me for a very long time, and so I started, calling that same colleague and just saying, can I process this a little bit more? And it was extremely helpful. And I did take a break. I took a short break on taking those types of therapy cases because the thought of having another one like that anytime soon was going to be too much. So I backed away, and timing was perfect because I ended up working on a lawsuit for the next 3 months. And then by the time it was time to come back to that specific type of a case, I was able to.
Okay.
So again, it's self-care, recognizing it, and being able to process it and go say, what was most difficult about this case? It was truly just the fear of a child's safety.
And yeah, it sounds very interesting, to say the least. Very interesting and very difficult. I'm curious about, since you work with narcissistic people, I'm
Mhm.
curious about the demographic population of the narcissistic folks that you work with.
My mostly at this point in time, it's been mostly males. Probably the age, the demographic area that I happen to be in is Caucasian, African American, and Hispanic. That just is the area that I live in. But I would say mostly Caucasian males at this point in time. That seems to be what I'm dealing with.
Any age range, any sort of job demographics or anything like that?
They blue collar to middle class to upper. I mean, it seems to cross all spans of economics and jobs, educated,
Hmm.
no education. It typically there, if there's no education, I have noticed a little bit of a questionable childhood trauma that has not been discussed, where I get little, I call it flares, where I think, I wonder if something happened when they were a kid, because I'm just kind of picking up on some things that don't really fit in with this, kind of macho mentality that's walking in, and think, okay, I wonder if there was a shift. Now, whether or not they always were predisposed to being this personality type or not, I don't know, but I have started to notice a little bit of that pattern, but it seems to cross over.
And when you have a narcissistic parent as your client, how do you work with them versus someone who's not?
I think it's important to meet them where they're at, but typically my style, which probably doesn't always gel with what our standards probably say, is I'm a very direct person, to a fault sometimes. And so when I have them at first, it's very much taking in the information, taking in their personality. That usually happens for the first maybe few sessions. But then there will be a point where they will try to manipulate me, or or just basically lie. And I will say, wow, that sounds kind of ridiculous. You sure about that? And then we have a discussion about in this room, and maybe that's worked outside of this room, but that's not going to happen in here. We have some real work to do, and we're talking about your kids, so we can cut through the crap and focus on what's going to work. And for me, at least, it's worked really well. It's easier to get there faster when there's a goal to be met versus maybe a different approach. And again, it's just because we're dealing with court, we're dealing with very, we're dealing with kids. But again, they've usually already gone through a laundry list of therapists and have felt that they have been able to kind of run the show. And so sometimes I think it's important for them to know that that's not going to happen today. So that's been helpful to me. And there's probably only been one personality that came in that did not work with them. And I recognized it very quickly and thought, this is going to get very volatile in my office very quickly. Watching his neck, his carotid, just thinking it's going to pop out, and recognized it and slowly brought him back down and was able to meet him and thought, this is the person who might do better visually. So I would make bullet points, email him. He would respond to some of those things, and then we would work on them the next time. As long as he had time to take in information ahead of time, he was able to then do the work in the room. But I found that if I tried to bring it up in the room, he would explode, become very volatile. So each person is so different, right? And what's going to help them be able to do the work. And for that particular client, I learned very quickly, okay, that sets him off. Whereas my other client over here smiles and says, I know, Nicole, I know you're not like the other therapist. So I'll do what you say. I'll stop calling CPS every week, or whatever crazy thing they're up to. It's like, I'm like, I know you're calling every week. Knock it off. Like, we can't get any work done if you keep doing this stuff. What? Well, I just, no. And then there's a few that do come in, and when they are telling this extraordinary story, I sit back and initially I think, are they lying? And then I think, oh no, they're telling me their truth. This is how they see what happened. They see it from that lens. This person's trying to harm them. That way it makes it okay for them to behave this way. So I've had a shift probably in the last couple of years as they come into my office. It's less about being lied to and more about them telling me their truth, what they perceive as what happened.
Wow. I can almost imagine that working with people like that in the capacity that you do, that they would get very litigious with you. Have you had that experience where they're wanting to sue you or get back at you?
Don't be jinxing me, Natalie. No, but I have a ton of malpractice. Oh my gosh, I have malpractice coming out of my ears, millions of dollars. So being a child custody evaluator is very litigious. Knock on wood, I've been fortunate. I have survived a couple of lawsuits when I was working for Child Protective Service, where we were able to win both of them. And so that taught me a lot about what to be aware of and how to prepare, and how to really do things in a way that should ever be called into question, that I'm ready for that. So far, so good. But I do have an extraordinary amount of malpractice, but I also happen to have, I have one attorney on retainer, and I have another one that I can call anytime I have a question, just to make sure that whatever I'm doing is really, on the safe side of things, more conservative. But then also, I increased my malpractice to cover board complaints, because I think for our field, board complaints are probably more prevalent in many ways than that. And so what I'm very aware of is, again, when I have that hat on of, if I'm an evaluator, I'm able to make a recommendation. If I'm a therapist, I'm not. So if I'm seeing the kid for therapy and I've got concerns for their safety, and I can't say, well, they need to stay with mom, because that's enough for a board complaint. And again, I haven't done a full evaluation. I haven't met all the family members. So that's very inappropriate and unethical. As a child custody evaluator, I can do that because I've done a full evaluation. I've met with everybody. I've taken in all the information, and I'm able to, as an expert, then provide a an opinion. And so it's always remembering, you know, like, what's my role? What's my scope? What I can or can't do. But man, I got to tell you, having an attorney I can pick up the phone, or I've even done it in the middle of session where I've shot out, hey, just give me 1 second. Let me ask, you know, my attorney if we're able to do that. And I'll, you know, send a text and get a response back. Because I think it, you know, our state alone is very litigious. But on top of that, I think, you know, people are hurt and are upset that things didn't go their way. So they can oftentimes come back to us. But even with a recommendation I make to court, doesn't mean the judge is going to follow it. You know, I'm at 100% right now. Yay. But again, there could be the day where the judge says, I'm throwing this out. I'm going to make my own ruling regarding, you know, timeshare custody or whatever. So I'm just aware of it, and aware that it's definitely something that's on my mind. And more so, I probably worry less about being sued and more about like personal safety. I'm just aware that as we see more horrific, I call them, you know, their family domestic crimes across the nation around areas of custody and divorce, I'm just aware and always conscientious when clients come in, when they leave, when I leave my office, you know, who's around. I've had security brought in before to sit in my office if I have concerns about certain clients' volatility or their previous criminal history, whatever it is. I just think we always need to be aware that people's emotions, especially around divorce and custody, they're so high. They're just so high that they may not behave the way they normally would. Yeah. And that can be dangerous. So I think I worry more about that than the other. But maybe I should focus more on that. Get some more malpractice.
Yes. And you know, you have some products that you have designed and written and to help people. Can you share about that?
So for therapists, I started a website called therapistcourtprep.com. And we offer a book for therapists on how to testify in court, how to deal with, you know, all of that information coming at you pretty fast, how to prepare your notes, how to prepare testimony, how to really have a court policy in place so that when someone asks of you, could you please write me a letter for court? There's a lot of rules about that letter that can really get people into a jam pretty quick. And so, and that's actually a freebie that's on my website for therapists it's the do's and don'ts of a court letter. But also just having a court policy in place regarding fees, what you will and won't do, because a lot of people are, you know, coming to you hoping that you're the answer. You know, their attorney said, go see a therapist. So they do. And then they think, oh, they'll write a letter saying I should have the kids. And that's not what therapists are set up for. So the clearer the policy is, the clearer it is for that client, whether or not this is where they want to be. And then also it keeps the therapist, you know, out of the, I call it the rabbit hole. Yeah. And so that's available. And then I teach a class it's an online course for therapists as well. Again, regarding, you know, court and how to survive it. And then my coaching that I do is really, it's all done on Zoom, which you might be familiar with. Yes. Zoom is a great platform for, you know, video conferencing, because it's pretty rare that the person I'm going to work with is actually in my city. And it's because it's coaching, it makes it a lot easier to do from wherever they are. Sure. And what they can do is they can forward me whatever the current court order is, or their request, so I can review it. And then we do like a short history on what's happening, what their concerns are, what goals they'd like to meet when they go into court. And then we practice actual questioning. If you're asked this, if you're asked that, how to respond, how to stay calm, you know, on the stand. And so that's probably one of my favorite things to do. I love the phone call or the email afterwards saying, court went okay, like it wasn't bad. Yes. So that's exciting too. So, and that's that. I have too many websites, but therapistcourtprep.com is an easy site to go to, or NicoleStolar.com.
Nice. Awesome. And so is that the best way that folks can reach you?
That would be great. NicoleStolar.com is NicoleStolar.com. And that one, I just knocked that website out because I thought, I just need a website just more for just like the lawsuits and the coaching. And so it's available there. You can just contact me there.
Okay. All right. And last question, Nicole. What is the number one tip that you would give to anyone who's currently in a situation where they are dealing with a narcissistic partner?
Is I have two. I don't follow rules very well. So one would be I would grab a book, maybe Disarming the Narcissist. Grab a book, just get some framework of what is going on. Extremely helpful. And I would definitely see a therapist. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It's a paid sounding board, to really be able to kind of dive into what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're hearing. But then I think having the book is really helpful to kind of give you that framework of, okay, this is making more sense, and you're not going crazy. That would be my number one tip. You're not going crazy.
Yes.
When you start to feel like you are, that's exactly when you need that sounding board, because it means that somebody has managed to make you feel that way, and you have to get stronger and know that you're not. And you absolutely can. And so I'm just going to do a little plug for Natalie. She didn't know I'm doing this. So for Natalie, there's not a lot of people out there that focus on this group, and which is incredible considering that there's such a large population of them. It's kind of crazy. So I would say reach out to Natalie if you are struggling with this or you have concerns about this. I've spoken with her at length, and I am just so impressed with her knowledge, but also just her compassion and her ability to work with someone who might be going through this. And that's what you need: somebody who understands it, can walk you through it, and can help you not feel like you're going crazy, because you're not.
Yeah.
So that's a gift. So thank you to Natalie for even having this, having me on, but just the opportunity to talk about this group that is very real. It exists, and it's great to have support.
Yes.
And it's not a bad thing to get support. It makes us stronger.
Yes, I appreciate that so much. Thank you so much, Nicole. And I feel like I can honestly talk to you for forever about this. I'm
Thank
just so
you.
passionate about it, and I know that you're passionate about what you do. Um, and there's just not enough awareness, I think. And
Mhm.
so it's awesome. I would not be surprised. Don't be surprised if you hear from me again. Come on back, Nicole. People love
Thank
you.
you.
But I
Thank you so
cannot
much.
wait. Yeah, and I'm so excited about what you're doing. I'm going to definitely get over there and snag my copy of your book and all of your
Oh,
resources. So I thank you so much for your time and coming.
thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.